Hello everyone, this is Konopka, and in this session I'm going to be talking about how to send custom data in CodeSite. So to do so, I'm first going to describe some of the various ways in which data is sent using CodeSite. There's a lot of built-in functionality, so I want to make sure everybody's on the same page with respect to what type of data can be sent using CodeSite. But then we also want to look at how to send custom data. And what I mean by this is really customizing the presentation of that data when it appears inside of CodeSite's viewer tools. And so there's two pieces that are needed to do that. It's the send custom data method and a formatter class. And so the formatter class, we created a descendant of it, and that can actually be used to hook into the sending process and the evaluation process to present the data in whatever way you see fit. And in many cases, that it can really provide a dramatic change in the way data shows up inside a CodeSite. So to start, CodeSite has quite a bit of built-in functionality for sending data. There's an extensively overloaded send method that takes care of all kinds of simple message and data types like numbers, strings, dates, and times, but also supports complex data types like object properties and even collections of items with their subproperties, string lists. There's also support for content specific type messages like version information for your executable and file contents and image structures and XML data and so forth. Um, to display the content of each of these messages, there's the message pane, which is the standard summary text that you're providing in the messages, but then also the inspector pane displays additional details. And there's four stock inspector types that handle most of the different display functions that we need. It's the text, simple text like you send over a long string, that uses the text inspector. The object properties, that uses the property inspector. If you were to send over TreeView data, well, specifically it's only used by like the send controls and send components methods. They are hierarchical in nature, and so the hierarchy inspector type is used. The table is for displaying grid data, and so we can use any of those for our own custom formatting if necessary. There's also the ability to have custom inspectors, which are enhanced advanced displays like the collection inspector, the XML structure pane, display, the color and image inspectors as well are very customizable. But we're really at this session really focused on these four stock inspectors and how we can leverage those to provide some additional display capabilities. So let's start off by taking a look at a sample application, which I have loaded into Rad Studio here. And the full source for this is included in the download link that will be presented at the end of the presentation. And so what we have here is a simple little database application. I'm loading data from a client data set that I've pre-populated with some XML data. It's player statistics for the Chicago Cubs for this past season. And to start though, I'm going to send out a bunch of data, and then I'm also going to send out some new custom versions. So let me go ahead and run my application, and I'll start by sending the standard messages. And these are things we've seen before, but I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page. So standard, string data. This is formatting the rectangle data, but presenting it simply as text. Here is the list. So this is showing a list of items with the font, for the number of fonts on my system. Here is the properties display that's used to display name value pairs, including nested values. The hierarchical view for sending over the controls is using the hierarchy stock inspector. So we get tree structure there. And then here are some of the custom versions that are included in CodeSite by default. So we have our highlight color value, the collection editor as you select each item. And here's our XML inspector pane, which shows a syntax view of the XML data that was passed to it. There's also a structure view that you can inspect each of the different node types and elements that make up the different fields and data and so forth. This is another custom inspector that's provided with CodeSite. The remaining two buttons that we have is the send record and send dataset. And so if I click both of these, I can navigate to an item. I click send record, click send dataset, and what I get is for this particular dataset record, all of the values of the fields of the dataset record and their current values, which is really quite nice to be able to do since there's no real data structure that represents a data set record. I mean, obviously there's the data set itself, but okay, I want the active record. Well, I can pass any data set to the function I'm calling in here, and we'll look at that in just a second. The team stats is showing the full data set, all of the records in that data set that I have access to. Now, granted, I wouldn't want to do this for a full, million record table, but for short tables, lookup tables, and just making sure that all the content is in there is quite useful to be able to log that associated with that message. So let's go take a look at what is actually going on in these calls. So the send dataset record version is using the CodeSite send method, but passing it the CSM dataset record message type. And by doing so, well, first, where is this defined? Well, it's defined in the CodeSite DB tools header file. So normally we're used to including the CodeSite logging, which has the CodeSite standard, the base logger that we can use called CodeSite, plus all the T CodeSite logger class, as well as the CodeSite manager. But the DB tools has the database specific stuff. So it defines this message type and a custom formatter for being able to format a dataset record. The CSM dataset message type is used to format an entire dataset, and it's using what I'm going to show next, and that is the stock table and stock properties inspectors to present that data. So what really we want to cover next is, well, what if we want to display our own? And that's what the next page is all about. So let me go ahead and run our application again. And if we go to this page, we'll see that I have a struct listed here with a bunch of different values, properties if you will, for a baseball player. And so I've just created a lightweight object, be able to record this, pass it around, move with it. But if I wanted to log this to CodeSite, I'd have to do something else because I don't have enough context to get any RTTI to present anything. So what I can use is a CodeSite formatter to do the work for me. So first let's see the output and then we'll see how it's accomplished. So when I click send players, I actually create populate 4 different baseball player structures and then send over the data to CodeSite. The first one for Anthony Rizzo here, has his name, it looks at the all-star flag, and if it's true it says all-star and the position, displays a blank line, salary, the number of games played, and the batting average. Jake Arrieta is a pitcher, and the custom formatter looks at that, and if it's a pitcher it actually displays not the batting average but the wins losses and the ERA for the pitcher. So these both are using a certain type of formatter, and it's the player summary formatter. This is displaying the player details, which uses the property grid as well as using nested properties to show a breakdown of some more of the statistics. John Lester's again as a pitcher, and that's actually includes the wins losses as an ERA for that data as well. So let's take a look at how this is all accomplished inside of our code. So if we click on send players, T baseball player is defined in the baseball player header. So that's where that's picking that up from. If we go back to our code here, we see that we populate the values. Again, this is contrived because I want to demonstrate what we do, but this could be populated any other way or under any other mechanism. We then call CodeSite send custom data, passing it the player summary message type. Now, this is not predefined. There's no unit that's defined this inside of CodeSite itself. I need to do that for this demonstration. And that's where that comes from, is inside of the custom formatters unit that is included with the project. So if I go to the top of our CodeSite form, well, I should go to the header because that's where the constants are. So I have the player summary constant descends or is based off of the CSM user. That is included in the CodeSite logging header. This is for user-defined message type, so it's not going to collide with any of the system level ones that CodeSite depends on. So that's typically what you'll end up using. The definition of the player summary formatter descends from the TCodeSite formatter and overrides a few methods, namely inspector type, format data, and type name. I do the same thing for the player details. That has the other constant that I've defined. So if we go back to the C++ unit section here, we can see what is actually being done. So for the player summary, the inspector type is just IT stock text. This is the summary, free-formed, whatever you want to do with that. To format the data, we get a reference to that data, and we can typecast that to the data structure that we're dealing with. We would know that because we're defining the formatter for a specific type. We use the add line function to add lines of information into the text portion of this inspector. So this is where we format the first and last name. If it's an all-star, we add all-star before the player position. Based on, we can display the salary in games played. If the position is a pitcher, we then display one set of data. Otherwise, we display the batting average. And then finally, we return in the type name what we consider this type name to be. It could have a real type name, or maybe it doesn't. In this case, we're just returning T baseball player, and that shows up in the message pane for all the attributes for this message. So these are all T baseball player types is the content that I'm displaying. Then for the second inspector, custom formatter is the player details formatter. We're returning back the properties version of that. And in this case, we actually use the add name value pair inherited function to add the name values to the property grid. And so it's pretty straightforward. We add that in. The one thing to note is that if you want embed or nested property values, you simply use a dotted notation for the main property name and then the sub-property name that's afterwards. So stats, games, bats, at-bats, hits, and average, and then also if it's a pitcher, these all get included. So that's what controls when we go to, say, Chris Bryant, that there's a plus here because those are nested properties all under the name of stats. So you have lots of flexibility, and you can do multiple dots. Each level of dot will be another nested property if that's what you chose to do. And then we have the returning the T baseball player type. So let's move on to the next tab, and that is we have the hierarchy. And in this example, I have a TreeView that is showing the standings for all the Major League Baseball teams, and I have two ways in which we're sending the data. The first is we're sending over the traditional approach. We're sending over the a string along with the nodes of the TreeView, the items property of that. So by doing so, we should expect to see certain amounts of data inside of CodeSite. although it's not quite sure how much will be there because the nodes, I don't know if it has any published properties or not. The second version of it is actually using a custom formatter that's defined for dealing directly with tree nodes. So it looks exactly the same. It's the same tree node structure that we're sending, except we're using custom data and a new custom formatter. So let's run the application again, and we'll bring up the viewer. We'll go to our hierarchy tab. We'll send out the nodes traditionally, and now we'll send them out formatted. So traditionally, I was afraid of that. Not too much information because there's no published subproperties of the item's tree nodes type. However, by using a custom formatter, we can actually say, well, no, I don't really care about the properties of that. I really want the content. And so here we can recreate the entire tree structure that was represented by the TreeView itself. So let's take a look in the code to see how this was accomplished. So back into our custom formatters unit, we have in the header two new ones. I'll kind of preface this now. Tree nodes is what I'm looking at and explaining next, but we'll also see one that uses for list items in just a minute. But know that the formatter, the constants are in this unit. The classes themselves are right here. So we have the tree nodes formatter and the list items formatter. And these are going to be useful things for us to have around to format this data in a unique way. So let's focus on the tree nodes. We'll scroll down. We've got the player details, and here's the tree nodes. And it's really kind of neat when we can get such a rich display with just this very little bit of code. So this is returning the inspector type that we want to use, which is a stock hierarchy because it's a tree. Then to format that data, we're taking the tree nodes and we're simply going to iterate through all the nodes and then use the add line function to add the node representation to our inspector pane. And in order to show the hierarchical nature, we simply add a tab character for each level of indentation that we need to have, which is recorded in the node's items level property. And then to get the text, this is what shows up inside the text content for that node, so we can display the full structure of it. And again, we're just returning back that this is indeed a tree nodes structure, so that we can see in the message panel what that is really representing. So it's pretty straightforward but wonderfully rich data that we get out from that. All right, one more page in our example app here, and that is the custom table. And this, similar in nature, we've got another common control. We've populated it through a bunch of different means, but now we want to see what this content is, or more importantly, we want to log it. We want to make sure that it's been, populated correctly, it has the right data, and so forth. Because it's not a direct mapping onto any particular structure. It's not like it just automatically connects to a data source. It has to be, each item has to be created and each sub item has to be added to it. So again, I'm going to have a send list view, which I can go ahead and click. I'll bring up my viewer here, so the send list view, and then I'll go and send the formatted view. So here's the cub stats as the properties. Now what we'll see is this is just sending over the list view object. So that's what this shows, is the list view cub stats. So it has just the published properties of that list view. While that may be interesting in what you want to see, in my particular example, I'm really more interested in the content. Does it have all the records and the columns of data that I expect it to? So we're going to use a table inspector to format this data. So let's take a look at what the implementation of that is. So in the custom table version, sending over the list view, or just sending over the list view as a regular object message. But if we do the send custom data version with the CSM list items, same data structure, same list view control, we can now present it differently because we've defined this list items formatter that uses a stock table. Now this is a little bit more complicated, not much, it's still less than a page at a pretty big font size here, is we get the list view itself and we iterate over the columns of the list view, and for each column we add it to the first row. An add line represents a row, so we build up S with each column name separating the columns with a tab character. So in the table view, the tab character is used to define columns. In the tree, the hierarchy, it's used to define indent level. Once we get the header record in place, we then go and rip through all the items for the rest of the list view. And that's a little tricky in the sense that because of the way the list view is structured, the first column is represented by the item's caption, but then the other sub columns are in the sub items. And so we need to iterate through those and extract those out, again separating each column with a tab character, and then when we're finished, add the full line as a row into the grid using add line. And then finally, list items is there. The one final piece to connect all this together is that we need to tell the CodeSite manager about these custom formatters. And we do that with, in the initialization section, we call CodeSite manager with the register custom formatter method, and give it the message type that we want to identify it with, the message constant we defined earlier, along with the actual class information for the formatter itself. And now any logger, CodeSite logger that's used inside of the application will now have access to this formatter and format your data in an appropriate way that you've defined. So just as a recap, in order to send custom data, we could create a formatter descendant, define a new message type if necessary, which usually it will be in these cases, specify the inspector type of those stock inspector values, format the data using add line and add name value pair, register the custom formatter, and then simply call send custom data. And define your message types, select from your various property values, use your add line and add name value pair methods. And here we've already shown some of the pieces there, sending the custom data. We've gone through each of the examples. And that's all the information that I have for today. As noted earlier, all of the source code for the test application in the formatters is included in the URL that's listed on the screen there. At this point, I'm wrapping up the recorded presentation and will now join in the live Q&A. And I wish to thank everyone for participating today. Thank you very much.
So if you have questions for Ray Konopka about CodeSite, or maybe Konopka VCL signature, Konopka signature VCL controls, we've got Ray for a few minutes. There's no Cubs playoff game going on.
Nope, not right at the moment.
Unbelievable. Cubs win. Cubs win. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Chicago is a happy city today.
Yeah, boy, oh boy. And then, so who do you want? You want the Mets or the Dodgers?
Either one we'll take.
Okay. And then who do you want in the World Series besides the Cubs? Anyone. Anybody but Kansas City, right? A Midwest battle.
Yeah, I think any of them would actually work well, but I'm not partial.
Too bad. Maybe one year, no, maybe not. Chicago Cubs and Chicago White Sox. Like when the Giants played the A's, we had an earthquake in '89.
Yep.
So,
There was this crosstown series years and years ago. I think it was like 1906 or something.
oh, God, yeah. So there's no questions, Ray. Do you want to add anything? I mean, I love CodeSite and all you can do. We have CodeSite Express bundled product. You can purchase CodeSite Studio separately. It's also part of the Rad Studio Solution Pack that you can purchase. But I don't know. It's quiet.
Yeah, well, that's sometimes good that all the questions get answered in the video itself. But no, I think it's good to see some different capabilities of what the product does. You know, I've done a lot of introductory demos and talking about the main things that you use CodeSite for, and this is just a way to extend it.
Yeah, well, maybe since when it was part of Raize software and you were out visiting customers at conferences and other things and people contacting you, is there any tough things that people wanted to log? I mean, sure, we can take an object and log information about the object and so on. What's the toughest things that people have tried to do with CodeSite? Or interesting and crazy?
Yeah, the aggregate objects. You know, people have built their own business objects that have embedded objects and nested relationships, and they want to be able to visually represent that in some new ways. That's something that people will leverage this technology for quite a bit. The other big thing that we find requests for is JSON, being able to send out formatted JSON code in a nice structured way, kind of like what we did for XML. So there's a send XML data, and the next version of CodeSite, when we can get that out, will include a send JSON function specifically for that purpose. In the interim, I had a session in last year's Code Rage that talked about creating a class helper that extended the CodeSite logger class to include a send JSON function, which uses the same technology that I demonstrated here, essentially formatting the data in a way that CodeSite can interpret it inside the object inspector and so forth, to taking a JSON payload and putting it into an object inspector view. And so those kinds of things are really cool to see, because they show the extensibility that we're not just tied to standard data types. When you start including the hierarchical views, you can now start showing relationships between things at a high level, not just at an individual object level, but we can see multiple objects together. And so sometimes that's very important when you want to see relationships between other things. And the table view is another really powerful way of representing data. And again, the key is CodeSite is all about logging the data to get that snapshot at a particular point in time. And the more rich information that we can get about what our application is doing at that point in time, we can see how it changes. We can analyze a later snapshot and see, is it still the correct data that we think it is? And that way we can ideally diagnose the problem more quickly, which historically has been the case, just from feedback that we've gotten and internally using it as well, that it does help locate problems much faster than having to rely on just the debugger to do your debugging.
And we had Jacob Thurman on earlier today, and he was talking about leveraging app analytics, but he also laid out some best practices for using app analytics all the way from the beginning, proof of concept to development to completion to deployment. Do you see users of CodeSite using it all the way through in initial design phases, through development, debugging, of course, even leaving it on sometimes when they're trying to track down in deployment?
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the major changes that went from CodeSite 1 to CodeSite 2 many years ago, was that it started out really in that debugging phase. Historically, for when I was developing Raize components for Delphi, and the components way back in the day were integrated very deeply into the IDE, and if you had a problem with the component, you brought down the IDE, and so it kind of came about because of that type of debugging that I needed for the components. But as it became a product and it got out into the field, it became very clear very quickly how important the same information could be on an end user's machine. And so rather than focus just on debugging, it became this application logging system from, like the app analytics, from the beginning stages. You're speccing out your code, you can put in CodeSite messages into those stubs that you have not yet implemented, so that you now have a record of that non-implementation in your log. And you know where to put it, you know where in the flow of your application that particular method is getting called. And so you can get this diagnostic view of what's going on in your system without really even needing to debug it in this point, because there's no debug information that's required. But then as you go through to the development, the debugging, and now you're talking about testing and QA, well, that's being able to have that logging information from the testers and the QA team, being able to duplicate a problem and capture the log of what was going on, giving that back to the developer now becomes another artifact of the process that the developer can use as more information about what was going on at the time, and then ideally be able to reproduce the problem, compare it against the reported log, and ideally locate the problem and fix it. The same is true once you deploy it. And we went through a lot of steps to simplify deployment, add in the abilities for doing logging on an end user's machine, controlling the amount of logging information that we record, provide ability to do filtering and blocking of messages to keep the noise levels down if you weren't interested in that, and some unique ways in which we do the logging, which is quite different than the traditional prototypical logging solution of log levels and things like that, adding some flexibility that in the long run helps make a better product because you have more information you can use about what your product is doing. And I can certainly see development teams leveraging both, the app analytics from how the application is being used with CodeSite for how is the application accomplishing those tasks, and melding the two together in some future form would be pretty interesting.
Do you have any development teams that you've heard from that use CodeSite as part of an automated testing system? Or is it really more after the fact, just getting those logs and then going and review them? I'm thinking if it's logging, couldn't the test run your app and the test then go into the log and see what the result was and do something with it? Or is it more a sort of linear sequential process?
I think it's probably more linear at this stage. I've not heard of any specific team. I know some teams are doing some things automated to capture the logs and keep them along with their testing, but I don't know if they're actually doing any external analysis of that as part of the validation steps. It's certainly possible that could be done, but I think at this stage there's definitely some the primary use of it really is to locate problems, capture the data while it's going on, but then if a problem does arise, be able to go back and analyze it. So it's definitely the analysis portion of the tooling to be able to locate problems, find relationships is really what the strengths are currently, but that's one of the things that could certainly be extended going forward.
And then I have to ask this, it's not for, I mean, you have support for Delphi and C++ Builder. Have other developers in other worlds figured out how to use other languages somehow by seeing how things work under the covers to use CodeSite with, let's say, JavaScript or Python or whatever? Choose your favorite, I guess, or not favorite, I don't know.
Well, it's actually quite interesting. Is over the years there have been a whole lot of different ways in which developers have interfaced with CodeSite. Some have done wrappers, some have done, Malcolm Groves, for example, years ago did a little wrapper inside a SQL server.
so that in his SQL Server scripts he could make calls to an object that would then get translated into CodeSite method calls, so that he could actually log things to CodeSite from another system. So so that's leveraged the .NET capabilities that were there, but others have done Java wrappers and other things like that. That's one of the beauties behind it, is that the protocol itself is pretty straightforward. It's certainly possible in the future that more and more languages are supported in what I would call a native approach, where the originating CodeSite message is done natively, like we do for the .NET side of things. There's a C# module. It's an assembly that has all the same functions that the C++ and the Delphi code units use. But again, it's all just done native for that language, but communicates with the same CodeSite dispatcher, CodeSite viewers, and so forth. Could that be extended for the Mac? Absolutely. Do it for Objective-C or Swift. There's really just the ability to capture the data in the format that's needed is pretty extensible.
Yeah, I could also see, because of the native code of our compilers for Delphi and C++ Builder, you could build a user-defined function for a SQL database and just call it as part of a trigger or stored procedure or whatever. So that's really straightforward, for example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, Ray, thank you so much. Okay, take care, Ray, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.